Ozark Highlands, Missouri, October, 1883. The air held the first clean, sharp promise of the frost to come, a warning that sent sensible men to chinking their cabins and splitting a final cord of oak. But Emilio Cavatera was not engaged in any sensible work. He was hauling rocks. From the creek bed, a quarter-mile below his homestead, he carried them one by one in a canvas sling. They were not handsome, squared-off quarry stones for a fireplace, but smooth, rounded river rocks, gray and brown and dull green, ranging in size from a fist to a loaf of bread. He wasn't building a hearth or a foundation wall. He was building his house again, from the inside out. His cabin, a standard single-wall structure of notched pine logs, already stood. Now, he was meticulously framing a second, thinner wall of planking 4 inches inside the first, creating a hollow space between the heavy exterior logs and the new interior surface. Into this cavity, painstakingly, he packed the river stones. It was slow, brutal work. Goss Trentham, the lumber merchant from town who'd sold Emilio the planks for this strange inner wall, pulled his wagon to a halt on the ridge overlooking the claim. He watched for a long moment, his face a mask of professional disbelief. He'd seen a lot of foolishness on the frontier, but this was a new species of it. He ambled down the slope, accompanied by Jedediah Croft, a carpenter who bought his lumber. "Cavatera," Trentham called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who supplied the very bones of every home in the county. "What in God's name are you doing?" Emilio paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He was a compact man, with the dense, quiet strength of a stoneworker. He gestured to the wall. "I am filling the walls." Trentham squinted at the gap, now half filled with a jumble of gray stones. "With rocks? You're turning your house into a well. You'll have damp and mold in there by Christmas. Besides," he kicked at the foundation stone at the corner of the cabin, "a solid limestone block. You're adding tons of dead weight. These footings were set for a log cabin, not a fortress. You'll have the whole structure collapsing on your family's heads." He delivered the prediction with the calm certainty of an expert. Jedediah Croft nodded sagely beside him. "He's right, Emilio. It's against all reason. Wood is what keeps a house sound, not a pile of creek rubble." The word they didn't use, but which hung in the crisp autumn air, was crazy. This Italian was a fool, building his own tomb. Emilio Cavatera simply picked up another river stone. It was heavy, dense, and cool in his hands. He looked at Goss Trentham, his eyes calm. "The weight is the point," he said, and slotted the stone into the wall cavity. What did this Italian hippocaust mason, a man from a world of ancient stone and ceramic, understand about thermal mass that the most experienced lumber merchants and carpenters of the Missouri frontier had tragically missed? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would rewrite the rules of survival in the unforgiving Ozark winter. But before we explore the profound physics hidden in those simple river stones, I want to invite you to be part of our community of historical detectives. If you enjoy stories about forgotten ingenuity and practical wisdom, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us bring more of these incredible tales to light. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand how a simple rock can hold the memory of a fire for days. Let me know in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a problem you've ever seen? Emilio Cavatera was not a frontiersman. He was not a hunter, a trapper, or even a farmer by trade. In his native Piedmont, he had been a fornacimedio, a master of kilns and ovens, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to the capture, storage, and slow release of intense heat. His hands knew the language of fire brick, of terracotta flues, of the deep, resonant warmth that radiated from 100 tons of stone hours after the flames were extinguished. He had built the bread ovens for entire villages, ovens that could be fired once in the morning and bake all day on the retained heat. He understood the ancient Roman technology of the hypocaust, the art of heating a building's very bones, turning its floors and walls into massive, gentle radiators. When he came to America with his wife, Sophia, and their 2 small children, Luca and Isabella, he brought with him not a knowledge of log construction, but a deep, almost instinctual understanding of thermal dynamics. He was drawn to the Ozarks by the promise of land, a place to build a life from the ground up. But the land had its own hard lessons. Their first winter, in 1882, had been a catastrophe of conventional wisdom. He had built his cabin exactly as his neighbors advised, as Goss Trentham's lumber dictated. Thick, well-notched pine logs, chinked with mud and moss, a large stone fireplace, built to the exact specifications of local custom. It was a handsome, sturdy cabin, and it was a thermal sieve. The fire roared, consuming a terrifying amount of the wood they had spent all autumn cutting and stacking. An hour after the flames were fed, the heat was already starting to retreat. The problem wasn't the fire. The fire was immense. The problem was the walls. The pine logs, for all their thickness, had very little mass. They could not hold the heat. The moment the fire died down, the immense thermal energy it had produced bled out into the frozen Missouri night. That first winter was a blur of misery and fear. Sophia and the children slept in their coats, huddled together in one bed. The fire barely outlasted the wood. The cabin was frigid and drafty by midnight. Every nail had a point of white frost on the interior walls. By morning, the water in the bucket was a solid block of ice. Their breath was visible at noon, even with a small fire struggling in the hearth. They were constantly cold, constantly feeding a ravenous fireplace that gave them only a small circle of temporary warmth in return. Emilio felt a shame deeper than the cold. He was a master of heat, yet his family was freezing. He had followed the local rules and built a perfect frontier cold trap. He had failed. That spring, as the thaw came, he swore he would not fail again. He would not build their house, he would build their kiln. The failure of the standard Ozark cabin was not a failure of craftsmanship. Jedediah Croft and men like him were excellent builders. It was a failure of physics, a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The enemy was not just the cold air outside. It was the rapid loss of precious heat from within. A log wall, even a thick one, is primarily an insulator. Insulation slows heat transfer, but it does not stop it. And critically, it does not store it in any meaningful quantity. Let's look at the numbers. A seasoned pine log has a relatively low density. It's filled with microscopic air pockets, which is what gives it its insulating properties. But its specific heat capacity, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature, is modest. A typical log wall on a 15 by 15 foot cabin might weigh around 6,000 pounds. When a fire pumps, say, 50,000 British thermal units, BTUs, of heat into the room for an hour, the air heats up instantly. The surfaces of the logs warm up, but they don't drink the heat in. The energy sits near the surface, ready to escape. The moment the fire dies down, the direction of heat flow reverses. The warmth radiates from the log surfaces to the colder objects in the room and is conducted straight through the chinking and the wood itself into the negative-degree air outside. The cabin could lose 10, even 15 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. This was the cycle of desperation his neighbors were trapped in. The family of Silas Blackwood, on the next claim over, burned through 8 cords of wood that first winter. Their days were a frantic race to feed the fire. their nights a slow surrender to the encroaching cold. Their reality was one of dramatic temperature swings. They were either sweating by the hearth or shivering in their beds. There was no middle ground, no sustained, gentle warmth. They were heating the air in the room, over and over again. And the Ozark winter was an infinitely patient thief, stealing that heated air every second of every day. The settlers were fighting a battle of attrition against the second law of thermodynamics, and without a radical change in strategy, they were destined to lose. Emilio Cavaterra knew you couldn't win by making a bigger fire. You had to build a better vault to store its power. The construction began in late summer. First, Emilio reinforced the foundation, digging down and laying a wider, deeper course of flat stones, mortared with a clay-lime mixture he perfected over weeks. Goss Trentham saw it and shook his head. Putting a $50 saddle on a $10 horse, Cavaterra. The ground will heave and crack it all. Emilio just kept working. Then came the inner wall. He framed it with 2x4s, leaving the crucial 4-inch gap. This was Jedediah Croft's main point of contention. "You're wasting 4 inches all the way around," the carpenter argued, standing in the middle of the small cabin, his arms outstretched. "That's square footage, man. Space for a shelf, a dry sink. And for what? An empty space that'll be a haven for mice and drafts?" "It will not be empty," Emilio replied calmly. And then the riverstones began to arrive. Every evening after his main work was done, Emilio, Sophia, and even the children Luca and Isabella would make the trip to the creek. Sophia and Emilio carried the large canvas slings, their backs straining. The children would fill buckets with smaller, fist-sized stones, their contribution essential for filling the smaller gaps. It was a pilgrimage for warmth. They hauled over 20 tons of stone that autumn, bucket by bucket, sling by sling. That's 40,000 pounds of carefully selected water-smoothed granite, quartzite, and feldspar. As the cavity filled, the cabin transformed. The walls, once resonant and hollow-sounding, became dense and silent. A knock on the inner planking produced a dull, solid thud, like knocking on a mountainside. The mockery from the neighbors continued, but it was now tinged with a grudging respect for the sheer labor involved. Silas Blackwood stopped by one afternoon. "It's the damnedest thing I ever saw, Emilio. You're building a prison wall in your own house. It'll hold the damp something fierce. You'll be smelling creek water all winter." Goss Trentham's objection was more technical and, to the onlookers, more convincing. He came with a ledger and a pencil. "All right, let's just figure this," he said, not unkindly. "You've added, 20 tons? That's the weight of 10 of my lumber wagons. Your original cabin, maybe 3 tons of wood. You've put a 40,000-pound load on a foundation meant for 6,000. I'm telling you, Emilio, as a man who understands structural loads, when the ground freezes hard and then heaves in the thaw, this cabin will shear apart. The weight is dead weight. It does nothing but strain the bones of the house." Emilio listened patiently to it all. He never argued. He never defended his theory. When Trentham finished his dire prediction, Emilio simply looked at the dense, heavy wall, now almost complete. He patted the inner planking. "Mr. Trentham," he said quietly, his Italian accent softening the words, "in my trade, weight is not dead. Weight is life. It is memory. This stone will remember the fire." Trentham just shook his head and walked away. The man was a poet, not a builder. He was building a metaphor. And metaphors make for cold comfort in a Missouri winter. To understand what Emilio Cavaterra had built, you have to stop thinking about a wall as a barrier and start thinking about it as a battery. A thermal battery. The principle is called thermal mass, and it's one of the most elegant and powerful concepts in thermodynamics. It all comes down to 2 properties, density and specific heat. Wood is not dense. A cubic foot of pine weighs about 25 pounds. It is an excellent insulator for its weight. Riverstone, mostly granite, is the opposite. A cubic foot weighs around 165 pounds, nearly 7 times denser than pine. This density means it can store far more heat energy in the same volume. But density is only half the equation. The other is specific heat, the measure of a material's ability to absorb and store thermal energy. A BTU, or British Thermal Unit, is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Water is the benchmark, with a specific heat of 1.0. Pine wood has a specific heat of about 0.6. The granite and quartzite of Emilio's riverstones have a specific heat of about 0.2. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. The wood can absorb more heat per pound than the stone, but this is where the crushing advantage of density comes in. Let's compare a cubic foot. The 25 pounds of pine can store 15 BTUs for every degree of temperature increase, 25 pounds times 0.6. But the 165 pounds of stone can store 33 BTUs for every degree, 165 pounds times 0.2. The stone wall, cubic foot for cubic foot, has more than double the heat storage capacity of the log wall it sits behind. Now consider the total mass. The 6,000 pounds of log in a conventional cabin have a certain storage capacity. But Emilio had added 40,000 pounds of stone. He hadn't just doubled his thermal battery, he had increased its capacity by an order of magnitude. When he lit a fire, he was doing something fundamentally different from his neighbors. They were just heating their room's air. Emilio was doing that, plus making a massive deposit into his thermal bank account. The fire burned for 6 hours, pouring tens of thousands of BTUs into the cabin. The air warmed, the inner walls warmed, and that heat began a slow, steady migration into the 40,000-pound core of Riverstone. The process was slow, but like water soaking into a giant sponge, the heat was being absorbed. When the fire went out, the magic began. In a normal cabin, the temperature would begin to plummet immediately, but in the Cavitera cabin, the flow of energy reversed. The now cooling air of the room became colder than the surface of the inner wall. The wall, warmed by the massive stone core behind it, began to radiate gentle, even heat back into the room. The stone core itself was now the furnace. It would release its stored energy not at the violent rate of a fire, but at a slow, deliberate pace, dictated by its mass and density. The card stated a release rate of 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. This meant that a cabin heated to 68 degrees Fahrenheit might only drop to 64 degrees Fahrenheit in the first hour after the fire died, and perhaps 60 degrees Fahrenheit the hour after that. The temperature drop was a gentle, manageable slope, not a terrifying cliff. Emilio hadn't built a barrier to keep the cold out. He had built a reservoir to keep the heat in. That winter, the Ozark Highlands were seized by a hard freeze that became a legend. For 21 consecutive days in January of 1884, the temperature never rose above 0. For most of that time, it lingered at 12 below, with a wind that honed the cold to a razor's edge. Trees on the ridges cracked like rifle shots in the night. Livestock had to be brought inside or they froze standing. It was the kind of cold that found every crack, every weakness in a man's preparations. It was a perfect, brutal laboratory for Emilio's experiment. At the Blackwood cabin, life was a desperate siege. They kept the fire roaring day and night, moving their beds into a tight semicircle around the hearth. The outer walls were coated in a thick, crystalline layer of frost. When Silas opened the door, the cold didn't just enter. It fell into the room like a physical thing. They burned through a cord of wood a week, and Silas's face was etched with the constant, gnawing anxiety of the woodpile shrinking too fast. Jedediah Croft, the carpenter, fared little better. His well-built cabin was tight, but it was still just a wooden box. He and his wife took turns staying awake through the night to feed the fire. A grim, sleepless vigil against the cold. The sheer labor of survival was exhausting them. At the Cavitera cabin, life continued with an almost unnerving sense of normalcy. Emilio would build one strong, hot fire in the morning, using just a few logs of seasoned oak. He would let it burn for 5 or 6 hours while the family went about their day. And then he would let it die out. Completely. By early afternoon, the fireplace was a bed of cold ashes, and yet the cabin remained warm. Not hot, not stuffy, but filled with a steady, radiant warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The domestic warmth technique was in full display. Sophia would knead bread on the pine table in the center of the room, her hands dusted with flour, far from any direct heat source. The butter in its crock on a shelf was soft and spreadable, not a frozen yellow brick. Luca and Isabella would play on a rag rug on the floor, dressed in simple woolens, not bundled in layers of coats. The air was still. There were no drafts chasing each other across the floorboards. The profound quiet of the place was its most remarkable feature, the silence of a home completely at peace with the winter raging outside its walls. Emilio would sit in the evenings, reading a book by the light of a single kerosene lamp, the only source of heat a memory locked away in the stones around him. The vindication came on the 14th day of the freeze. Goss Trentham was making his rounds, checking on families, his wagon loaded with emergency supplies of firewood for which he was charging a premium. He was a practical man, not a malicious one, and he felt a responsibility for the people who had built their homes from his lumber. He found the Croft family exhausted, the Blackwoods grimly rationing their remaining logs. He sold them what they needed, his heart heavy. This cold was a killer. On his way back to town, he passed the ridge overlooking the Cavitera place. He saw no smoke coming from the chimney. A spike of pure dread went through him. No smoke in this cold meant only one thing. They had run out of wood and were freezing to death. Or worse, they already had. He whipped his horse down the trail, his mind racing through the horrific possibilities. He remembered his own confident predictions of collapse and failure, and they tasted like ash in his mouth. He practically fell out of his wagon and hammered on the door, shouting Emilio's name. The door opened. Emilio stood there, wearing a simple shirt, his expression one of mild curiosity. Behind him, Trentham could see Isabella sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden doll. A wave of gentle, stable warmth washed over him, a physical shock that was utterly incomprehensible. He stared past Emilio to the fireplace. It was dark. There were no flames, no glowing embers. It was stone cold. "My God, Cavitera," Trentham stammered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Your fire? It's out." "Yes," Emilio said simply, "since this morning." Trentham was at a complete loss. His mind, which understood the solid, predictable world of board feet and load-bearing walls, could not process this. He had just come from 2 homes that were roaring furnaces, yet were still losing the battle. This house had no fire at all, and it felt like a mild autumn day. He stepped inside, his boots loud on the floorboards. He looked around, his eyes searching for some trick, some hidden stove, some explanation. There was none. He remembered Emilio's words from the autumn. "This stone will remember the fire." Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he walked to the interior wall, the simple pine planking that hid the cabin's secret. He expected it to be ice cold, like every other wall in the county. He pulled off his thick glove and pressed his bare forearm against the wood. The vindication scene was not a shout, but a whisper of stored energy. He expected the biting cold of inert timber. Instead, what he felt was a deep, penetrating, impossible warmth. It wasn't hot to the touch, not like a stove. It was a living warmth, a gentle, radiant energy flowing from the wall into his skin. He pressed harder, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was real. He slid his arm down the wall. It was warm from floor to ceiling. The entire house was a radiator. The proof was undeniable, a physical sensation that shattered his entire understanding of how a house should work. He stood there for a full minute, his forearm pressed against the wall, his mind slowly rebooting. He turned to look at Emilio, who was watching him with that same infuriating, quiet patience. "How?" Trentham finally whispered. Emilio gestured to the wall. "The fire heats the stone. The stone then heats the room. For a very long time." Trentham stayed for an hour, watching, feeling, trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with a lifetime of experience that told him it was impossible. He finally left, his mind reeling. But he returned the next day in the late afternoon. It had been 36 hours since Emilio had last lit a fire. The temperature outside was 15 below. Trentham brought a thermometer with him. He knocked, entered, and placed it on the central table. They watched as the mercury slowly settled. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Trentham sank into a chair, the full weight of the revelation hitting him. All the mockery, all the confident predictions of failure, all his expertise. It was all wrong. He looked at Emilio, no longer seeing a foolish immigrant, but a man who possessed a knowledge so profound it seemed like magic. "You didn't build a wall to keep the cold out," Trentham said, his voice full of a new and unfamiliar awe. "You built a vault to bottle the fire." News of the stone-filled cabin traveled slowly at first, then with the speed of a spring thaw. It wasn't Goss Trentham who spread the word initially. His pride was too deeply wounded. The spread began with a letter. Emilio, whose English was still halting, had Sophia help him compose a long letter in Italian to a cousin in St. Louis, who was also a stonemason. In it, he described in meticulous detail the construction of the walls, the type of stone, the ratio of clay and lime for the foundation mortar, and the results of the winter test. He included sketches of the double wall framing and a table of wood consumption versus interior temperature. His cousin, a practical man named Giorgio, was fascinated. He shared the letter with his colleagues in the small, tight-knit community of Italian masons and builders in the city. They were men who, like Emilio, understood stone not as a dead material, but as a living medium for capturing and manipulating heat. The letter was copied by hand and passed along. One copy made its way to a German stonemason working on the breweries in Herman, Missouri, a man who understood the thermal properties of lagering cellars. He immediately saw the genius in reversing the principle, using mass to keep heat in rather than out. By the following autumn, the technique now dubbed the cavitera wall, or the heat battery house, was being attempted by a handful of brave families in 3 Missouri counties, Gasconade, Franklin, and St. Charles. The masons, who could now find work not just on foundations and chimneys, but on the very walls of houses, became its greatest evangelists. They were the ones who could explain it to skeptical farmers and carpenters. Goss Trentham, to his credit, eventually became one of its most powerful advocates. Having seen the proof with his own eyes, he began offering a cavitera package, pre-cut lumber for the inner wall framing, sold alongside a wagon load of river stone, for which he'd staked a new claim. By 1890, dozens of homes in the Ozark Highlands featured the dense, heat-hoarding walls, and their owners enjoyed a level of winter comfort and fuel security their neighbors could only dream of. The quiet genius of Emilio Cavitera's Riverstone wall was that it anticipated, by nearly a century, the core principles of modern passive solar design and energy-efficient building. Today we call what he built a thermal mass wall, or a trombe wall. Building science now has precise calculations for the R values of insulation and the specific heat capacity of materials like concrete, brick, and stone. We understand that a truly energy-efficient home is a system, a balance between insulation, resisting heat flow, and thermal mass, storing heat energy. Emilio didn't have the scientific vocabulary, but he had a deep, hands-on, generational knowledge of the principle itself. He knew that a structure's ability to weather a period of extreme cold was directly proportional to its capacity to store energy during the periods when it was available. His simple, elegant solution was a masterclass in resilience, using a low-cost, locally available material to solve his family's most pressing problem. In the end, the story of Emilio Cavaterra isn't just about a clever building technique. It's about a fundamental shift in perspective. His neighbors, for all their hard-won frontier experience, saw a house as a shield, a thin barrier of wood meant to hold the wilderness at bay for a few hours at a time, a battle that had to be fought anew every single day with the brute force of a roaring fire. Their solution to feeling cold was always to add more heat. Emilio, coming from an older world, saw the problem differently. He understood that you don't fight the winter, you negotiate with it. You absorb its opposite when it is plentiful and release it slowly when it is scarce. He knew that a wise man doesn't just heat a room, he charges a battery. The stones in his wall were a savings account for warmth, a physical memory of the sun and the fire, a quiet, solid promise that even after the flames died, their energy would remain. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the science and the history as fascinating as we did, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other modern technologies do you think have older, low-tech ancestors? Your engagement helps our community grow. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, inspired by historical practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional reconstructions. The building techniques described are based on real thermal principles. Any application of these or similar methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.